All right, I'd like to offer some feedback on the Biodiversity and Rachel Carson quiz. So, starting with the Google Forms portion, let's kind of go through and talk about these different questions and responses. Number of different species found in a particular area measures what? It's a definition of biodiversity. Biodiversity increases what happens to ecosystem stability. More organisms you have in an ecosystem, the more stable it is. So if you increase organisms, increase biodiversity, you increase stability, which is represented the same in both plots A and B on the pictures. Well, what is the same? Well, if you compare, it's a little lopsided. There's a lot more of these kind of trees. They look like deciduous trees compared to this other one. But if you count the number of different kinds of species or kinds of trees on each plot, they actually are the same. So they have what's both the same in these cases would be species richness. So they have the same richness of different kinds of trees. Which term is best represented by the picture? So we see all kinds of different organisms. And so they would be representing different species. We can't see their genes. Genetic biodiversity is relative to a population. So species biodiversity is what's shown here. All right, so plot A and B differ by what term? So they have the same species richness, the same number of different species in that habitat or space, but they are different in relative abundance. Relative abundance has to do with how many of each kind you have. So is it lopsided in favor of one species over another? So relative abundance is what's different about these two. So in this case, relative abundance is slanted in favor of these deciduous trees. All right, producers photosynthesizing with carbon dioxide absorption and oxygen production, and wetlands providing water filtration and flood control represent an example or examples of what? So those are things that nature does for us and are helpful. And so they are what are called ecosystem services. Greater biodiversity improves or increases the ecosystem services that we benefit from. A general rule about biodiversity. As biodiversity increases, ecosystem stability increases. Biodiversity increases, ecosystem stability increases. Which choice below can explain why high biodiversity is a good thing? Well, there's economic value, in some cases direct and indirect. We as humans depend on ecosystems for our own survival. Medicines and modern agriculture rely on biodiversity to develop new products. And biodiversity has aesthetic and scientific value. So they all apply. The map shown illustrates which threat to biodiversity. Well, if it's talking about spending winter farther north, and they're saying temperature across the U.S. has gotten warmer from 1966 to 2005, that is a span of time where you can get a strong difference in averages. So that's looking at changes in climate, causing them to shift their migration routes and winter nesting or winter habitat area. And so climate change is the threat in this case. The picture shown represents which threat to Minnesota's biodiversity? All of these organisms here are examples of invasive species. Invasive species. Which threat to biodiversity is best represented by the picture here? Well, this is a monoculture, and while very much beneficial to us, the fact that this field exists is a habitat loss for all the species that would have used it prior. Which threat to biodiversity is best represented by the lake picture here? So our lakes turn green and gross when excess nutrients gets in them, and then we get algae blooms. So when phosphorus and nitrogen get too much in the water, algae blooms happen, and that's called fertilizer runoff, or pollution based on fertilizer runoff. And the actual process in the lake is called eutrophication. Which human efforts could result in conserving or protecting biodiversity? Well, if we spent more emphasis on renewable energy, that would be a protection. Developing more sustainable land use practices would be a help. We wouldn't emphasize non-renewables because many of them have their own drawbacks, plus they're non-renewable, that we can't replenish them once they're gone. So we need a system that's sustainable over time. Increasing habitat fragmentation would make it worse, so clear-cutting forestry would also make it worse, but we could also consider enacting laws that protect the environment. So these three all would apply. Alright, looking at this diagram, we're seeing parts per million of these little dots getting more concentrated as you move up a food chain. And that was an example from your notes called biological magnification. What did Rachel Carson promote to societal leaders through her writing of Silent Spring? And her main message to all of us was recognition of the mismanagement and overuse of commercial chemical pesticides. She never said we were going to ban them altogether. She never recommended that. She just said that we were being asked to trust them a little too much the way they were using them at that time. So she didn't propose an all-out ban. Aldo Leopold did not write Silent Spring. And then further funding of aquatic research of marine organisms. While she might have liked that, that's not what Silent Spring was about. Pesticide runoff from agricultural lands into refuge waters impacting fish-eating species was best shown here. And that was Tule Lake, California in the Klamath Basin from surface waters and underground seas. What did Rachel Carson push for in her book Silent Spring? She wasn't trying to get wildlife sanctuaries, but she did want the public to become aware of the potential dangers of pesticide mismanagement. She wasn't proposing a lawsuit against the chemical industries. She didn't want to completely ban them. Which book by Rachel Carson, published in 1951, challenged the notion of humans as conquerors and controllers of nature, but instead portrayed us as nourished and sustained by natural resources, similar to Leopold's voice. The need to work with nature, not always against it. And that book was called The Sea Around Us. Pesticides were refined chemicals from World War II, originally developed by the Germans to have an effect on the nervous system of an animal's body. So they were the nerve gases. Rapid decline in biodiversity would imply which phenomena? Well, a rapid decline in biodiversity would imply a mass extinction in the works. Which term below fits the picture here? So, aphids and aphids eating your garden crops could be given predators to feed on them, like these Asian beetles, and that could be a way to deal with those insect pests that's not a chemical. So what would that be called? Biological augmentation, you might say. Not Bob's Bugs Be Gone. Name that sitcom if you can remember. Yellowstone's entire ecosystem is reshaped following the North American fur trade, indicating that beaver are what? Well, they're really important to their ecosystem, so they're known as a keystone species. Choosing this mug daily as opposed to a disposable one-use cup for your coffee means you are considering what relative to conserving biodiversity, and that is thinking sustainably. Which term best fits the oil well pictured here? This would be a non-renewable resource. Historically speaking, which term best fits the bison here? As Europeans came on the scene, we overexploited them, overexploitation of that resource. Which term best fits the turbine pictured here? Wind is known as a renewable resource. This picture shows the land being broken up into smaller pieces of different things happening on the land plots, and so that is habitat fragmentation. Today's mass extinction underway differs in what way from the previous 5 on Earth? Humans are here and are responsible. Where is this place of conserved biodiversity? This is actually near a bench overlooking the park known as Nye Park, a couple miles down the road. And there you go. We will do another screencast talking about the essay portion next.